Our next speaker is John Kurtz from Mercy Corps, and he's going to be talking about contingency approaches to measuring resilience.
Thanks. So Mercy Corps, I think like a lot of agencies, you all may be able to relate to this, are doing increasing number of projects with the stated goal of strengthening resilience. But by their own admission, not necessarily knowing what that means, much less how we would know if we got there. And as an evaluator, that makes me a bit uncomfortable. So we've taken on an effort to try to pin down some reliable measures that we can use, in particular that fit within the constraints of an NGO context. And we've done that also in collaboration with all the folks you see up here and others. So I'd just like to lay out a bit of how we're going about doing that. The starting point is really trying to move away from what I see as the current conceptual ambiguity around resilience. So this is a typical conceptual framework. This happens to be part of USAID's, where you see pretty much anything you can imagine doing in terms of a programming in there, right? And okay, to be fair to USAID, that makes sense because they're trying to take a big tent approach. They're trying to, bridge the humanitarian and the development silos across bureaus so it works. But it doesn't, in their case or in ours, help us say what we should be doing differently, more of, less of. So that doesn't, I think, get us beyond where we are in terms of current practice. So the state of the field that we're trying to move towards is one where we have a sense of, understanding in the frame of resilience to what for who. We have a sense of what are the major capacities or determinants of resilience given those parameters. So a situation where we could say at some point down the road that for urban areas in South Asia, resilience against floods, that there are a number of characteristics or capacities that we see over time as standing out as enabling those households or those communities to be able to withstand floods and maintain a certain level of well-being. And clearly they would have more weight on some than others. You take another example of pastoralists in the Sahel to, in this case, severe drought, and we would see another set of determinants come out as important for resilience there. And I think these are purely made up at this point, by the way. But we do actually have some where we can base these on some coefficients and whatnot. But the point is really that to have a single index for resilience that was essentially an aggregation of all these capacities doesn't make a lot of sense when we know that those capacities are going to differ based on the type of shocks and other parameters. So the way we're trying to move towards this is a working approach at the moment, but it essentially involves within a given context for a population of interest, working to identify what the capacities are most likely going to contribute to resilience in that type of shock. And then testing the predictive power of those characteristics or capacities wherever we have the chance to be able to say, yes, we're no longer just guessing that this is something that's important, but we've seen through our data and our experience that it does make a difference. From there, then, being able to use some of these validated capacities that we trust now as a way of doing program evaluation, especially where we can't test against a shock or a major stressor. And then, where possible, coming back ex post to be able to do some follow-up to look at a recovery period so that it's not just an outcome against a shock right afterwards, but looking some years hence. So I'll walk through a few examples of how we're doing this. So in terms of defining or identifying capacities that are most likely to make a difference to a given shock, here we're using a framework of organizing capacities that's, I think, having some growing acceptance, of categorizing capacities around absorptive, adaptive, and transformative. This builds off some work of Chris Bennett from IDS. Tim has also written some on this, so if you want to get more into those, you can look in those sources. But in each context, the process is to basically, based on the literature and good qualitative work, consultations with people who are affected by these shocks and stressors, try to understand, in terms of absorptive capacities, these are what stand out as most important in the past. So, you know, crop insurance really made a difference last time that there was a major drought for that population. So did, you know, land tenure policies in terms of their abilities to really invest in the land. So these are our hypotheses coming in. And then, no, that's actually perfect. So, we can go to the next one. The challenge is that I think a lot of approaches to measuring resilience stop there, roll those capacities up into an index and say we're going to measure that and call it resilience. We have an example of a midterm evaluation of a food security program in Myanmar where we tried to take that approach, and I think it highlights some of the shortcomings of that. Because in this case, you know, we had some capacities and we had particular measures around those, and we were able to see change in those over the life of, you know, the first half of the program, including to an outcome, in this case food security. But to call that resilience was a little bit disingenuous in this case, because what happens is that we don't know, go ahead, if in this case household dietary diversity is increasing and we see that closely linked with these productive livelihoods and collective community action capacities, how do those act in the face of, you know, another major shock there? And in this case we didn't really have one to benchmark against. So to me that's where it's important to distinguish, okay, this is a good food security program. When and if we can be able to say that those outcomes were maintained or recovered quickly after a shock, then I think we can start to call it, you know, more truthfully a resilient strengthening program. We may have some help with that here soon. So the next stage in our process is really to take the opportunity where we can to be able to look at, to test those, you know, presumed capacities, resilience capacities in the face of a shock against a certain outcome. We've been using food security outcomes a lot, but a group of us in the technical measurement group for resilience measurement, you know, agreed, and I think this is pretty widely shared, that, you know, you could swap in other outcomes. It could be nutrition, it could be psychosocial well-being, whatever you're trying to achieve resilience for. So in this case, we have an example of how we've tried to do this just with a simple cross-sectional assessment in southern Somalia, where, you know, we weren't doing programming, but the area opened up a couple of years ago after the complex crisis there, and we went in to take a look at, okay, we know some households fared better through that. What characteristics, as far as we could tell, made a difference to their ability to, you know, essentially maintain food security in the face of conflict and severe drought there. So this is the results of an OLS against coping strategies index, and I think the important part in here is that we did factor in exposure to shocks. So we're saying, okay, this is coping strategies as they relate to being hit by a drought or exposed to conflict. And so you can see some of the weight, these are elasticized coefficients, to see which characteristics actually stand out as important, which actually we're working against, you know, in this case, less distressful coping. So those would be then our closest guess at some validated capacities that we can, next time going doing evaluation work in this area, we have a pretty good sense that these are important factors. There's some other examples that we've done similar things, but in the actual context of a program evaluation, to be able to first say, in this case it was a conflict management program in Ethiopia, to be able to say, okay, we've made a difference to, you know, these intermediate outcomes in terms of freedom of movement, access to productive resources, and then the next stage is doing an analysis after a shock, in this case the same drought in the Horn in 2011, to be able to say, okay, which of those capacities or intermediate outcomes linked to these, in this case, food security outcomes, that we can then start to talk about resilience. And here you can see that, again, some characteristics or capacities stand out as having made a difference to certain coping mechanisms, and others really didn't. So that's telling for us as well going forward. The last is this fourth step of trying to understand, okay, what about the next shock? Because we know these shocks are different, they're not static. So trying to take the chance to come back, in this case it was in Niger, there was a project that was dealing with urban households in the face of the drought of '09, I think. And we had some evaluation data on that, but there was a food price shock 2 years after that, and we were interested to see, did those same households, continue to show more resilience to, in this case, food insecurity, or in terms of savings and income, than others. And the results were, reasonably encouraging, but I think it was more of the process of going in and examining that to see in this recovery period, that's one that's sort of under-examined within resilience. So, the parting words that I usually give are, I guess, a bit cautionary, that given the sort of complexity and the changing nature of the shocks that we're talking about, the conditions that the populations are living in, that we're interested in, even if we identify some of these reliable capacities or determinants, there's really no certainty that next time around those are still going to be the most important. So it's sort of the image of looking off the back of a moving train, and we're not really sure what's coming around the bend there. I'll leave it at that.
Here is Daniel Aldrich from Purdue University, and he's going to be talking about building resilience, social capital, and post-disaster recovery.
Good morning. I'm going to be audacious and actually flip what John said. I'm going to argue that from 4 quantitative and qualitative studies that we've been doing around the world, we would argue there is one factor that we consistently found to provide resilience, which we define as the communal capacity to deal with shocks in almost every case, and that we believe is social capital. The quick version is the book's available at Amazon.com. Feel free to more in my next 10 minutes.
No advertising.
But this project began actually with New Orleans, where I lived in 2005 with my family. And we began interviewing survivors around the city, those we could find over the first year. And we did a simple mapping of 3 different types of data: geographic information, where people lived; water depth, how much water was in their homes, that is, the level of the shock they experienced; and then the level of recovery that they told us on a scale of 1 to 5, how things had gone. Green is a 5, things went well. Red is poorly. So very quickly, if you notice here, over the first year, there are 2 different phenomena that we found. One is there was no obvious connection between levels of water damage, that is, the blue darker areas had more than 10 feet of water, or the lighter areas, the yellow ones, had less than 3 feet of water. There's no obvious connection between self-reported recovery after the shock and levels of water damage. The other thing that you might notice is what we call clustering. Individuals who tended to do well, that is, they said there were green levels, those individuals often lived near other people, closer to other people, people living nearby. So this was the first thing that we saw in the 4-case project that we did, beginning back in 1923 in Tokyo, going to 1995 in Kobe, Japan, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and then Hurricane Katrina. For all of these disasters, we believed the information would be found not at the individual level or the household level, but rather community resilience was found at the community level, that is, at the block or neighborhood level. So all the data in the book comes from this level of communities, wards, neighborhoods. We found in disaster recovery, published information at least, there are 5 major theories of recovery. The most obvious is why we're all here today: aid or money. The image of cash there speaks well to all of us. We often believe that more money made available to survivors, either through private insurance, through transfers from government or NGOs, or through self-savings, that somehow those individuals will do better after a major shock or a crisis. Political scientists might argue the middle top image of governance, that is, areas that are less corrupt and more open in the process of recovery, how they spend their money, those areas might have a better outcome following a shock. Third argument up top right would be damage, the level of shock, how long the drought lasted, how much water was in people's backyards or in their basements, or in my case, into my second level of my house. We imagine that the more damage that's done, the slower the process of recovery, the more difficult it is to recover. The bottom 2 images encapsulate population density. We often imagine that urban areas will have a harder time recovering because finding free space for short-term housing is more difficult, and also because there's more difficult to evacuate those individuals. The bottom right-hand image comes from the favelas in Brazil. There, a very thin line divides the dirt-floored shanty towns from the individual pools and the condominiums on the right side, inequality might matter as well. These theories, I would argue, don't capture the internal dynamics of the various communities there. So in the book, I argue that there are three types of mechanisms that tie us to each other. We call bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. Bonding social capital connects individuals who are quite similar. So for example, if you're a Patnavar fishing member in Tamil Nadu, most of your friends are also fishing members there in the same caste. If, on the other hand, you're a middle-class Washingtonian who works in AEA, probably here today with your friends as well. So homophily means our networks are very similar to who we are. That's bonding social capital. Bridging social capital, in contrast, means we link across groups by ethnicity, background, caste, education. This might be through a club, this might be through a sports team or an educational institution. Oftentimes, bridging social capital, we know, can dampen, for example, interethnic violence, provide ways of communicating during shocks. The final type of connection we call linking social capital. This is the information that you have that comes from someone, not even in your own network necessarily, but someone that you know in a position of power, someone with legitimacy and authority. In Tamil Nadu, someone might know the collector, the government representative in their area. In New Orleans, maybe they knew someone in the Red Cross. And during times of crisis, those kind of links we found provide critical resources. There are really three main mechanisms we found through which social capital improves resilience post-shock or post-crisis. The first decision made by any survivor is what we call exit or voice. The costs of rebuilding after a disaster are immense. There are financial costs, even for those individuals with insurance. And the vast majority of individuals in our studies at least do not have insurance. But even with insurance, often a big gap between the provided money that you get and the actual costs of rebuilding. There are also psychological costs. We know using the Kessler-6 index, individuals who suffer disasters have much higher rates of anxiety and depression than individuals who haven't suffered those. And there are also time costs. Individuals who've been through a disaster have to wait before their businesses, their entrepreneurial things begin again. So those costs make restarting elsewhere a viable alternative to many. We call that exit. If you decide to leave your community and begin someplace else. And voice means you decide to stay behind in the damaged community, whatever the costs start to rebuild. But simply, the more bonding capital that we've found in communities, the more likely individuals were to use voice and not to use exit after disaster. The second mechanism was collective action, the ability to work together on a problem. Now, many of us have issues that we feel strongly about. Very few of us act about those issues. We call this free riding. Many of the challenges facing communities post-disaster involve collective action problems. Problems that cannot be solved by one family or one individual working independently. I'll just give you two quick examples. In New Orleans in 2005, one small area decided to come back in August of 2005, less than 2 months after the disaster. They came back to an area with no running water, no food, no local grocery stores, and of course no utilities, no schools. They called the local energy company and asked it to be turned back on. They were told if they could get enough signatures in a petition, within a week, they'd have power again. They got over 1,000 signatures in 5 days. These individuals were able to contact each other. They had the ability to work collectively. In contrast, in Kobe, Japan, after the 1995 earthquake, many communities there failed to act collectively because they had no information on their neighbor's cell phone address where they had gone to. They couldn't work as a group to solve problems. We know many of the challenges, including crime and looting, those come from the inability of individuals to solve these problems collectively. The last mechanism we found we call informal insurance or mutual aid. Individuals who before the shock had strong connections to neighbors and to friends could draw on resources then after the disaster, whether it was, for example, childcare help, help finding jobs. We know that in many of these cases, individuals who had more bonding and bridging social capital had better recoveries, more access to resources than those without. So very quickly, I'm going to show you some data that we collected from two examples that we had in Tokyo and Kobe, Japan. We divided Tokyo in 1920s into communities with higher levels of collective action, with more bonding and bridging social capital, and those without. And we tracked population recovery. Did neighborhoods in Tokyo become ghost towns, devoid of population, or did they become areas that were rebuilt and repopulated? Using simply those two variables you can see on the right side, we've tracked the population recovery levels for those with high levels of social capital, and the left, those with lower levels. The averages between the two of them are different by about 6%. That is, there's a 6% positive recovery rate for those communities in Tokyo 100 years ago, with more collective action, compared to a 0% change on average for those communities without those higher levels of social capital. And I can show you the eye test. But basically, we had in this model a number of different factors. And the most important of that was we could actually predict population recovery by neighborhood in the 1920s based on turnout in local elections. Individuals who are more connected into their community, as you know from recent experience, government is often a public good. And the ability to work collectively to vote often provides no direct benefits to those who did. We saw voting as a collective action. We also found correlations with higher levels of demonstrations and mobilizations in the area. We tracked qualitatively 2 neighborhoods in Kobe, Japan, after the 1995 earthquake. These 2 neighborhoods are shown side by side here. They're similar in many ways, in terms of population, income, and so forth. If you look at the measures we have of social capital, how long they've lived in the area, whether they're born there or born elsewhere, and if they're renting or owning their homes, into the community on the right that we called Fukushima B, that community had much higher levels of social capital, better recovery levels. And we tracked this, in fact, over 9 wards in Kobe, over 13 years. So again, our question was, who repopulates following a massive disaster? And you can see here very different population recovery levels. Some communities are doing quite well before the disaster in 1995, and then they drop down. Others are dropping down before and they shoot back up. So the question for us to answer, of course, was why would some communities in Kobe rebound from a disaster like this and repopulate, while others simply lose population over time? You can show the eye test. Again, the most important level here for us was the number of nonprofit organizations formed locally. The ability of the communities to mobilize collectively determined to a large degree their ability to show resilience after disaster. My last slide then says, if we believe that social capital is important across these 4 disasters, and again, we've got data on all 4 of them in the book, what can we do then as practitioners, as scholars, as residents? So we have 4 different programs we've been testing in Africa, in India, America, and Japan. I don't have time to talk about them in depth, but we call these the Mr. Rogers strategy, the top left, the block party, that's the top right, the focus group, that's the bottom left, and community currencies, that's the bottom right. So very quickly, okay. So the Mr. Rogers strategy is very simple. We know following disasters, whether it's in India or Japan or America, first responders, by and large, are not officially trained police officers, National Guardsmen, and so forth. The first responders, by and large, are neighbors. And what we found was, whether it's in Kobe in 1995, or recently in Tokyo, Japan in 2011, people who were saved in the first few days after a disaster were saved by their neighbors. So right now we have plans that we're working on in Wellington, New Zealand, in San Francisco, and elsewhere, where we actually train individuals to get information on their neighbors. If you know you've got a neighbor who's sick, who needs diabetes medicine, who's in a wheelchair, so we encourage neighborhood local watch members and neighbors to begin to know their neighbors more clearly. That is, get to know your neighbors, get to know them with phone numbers, email addresses, rather than just having 3 days of food and water, which is quite helpful, and know who your neighbors are and to reach them in case of a disaster. The second option we call the block party. Now, this is from Indiana where I live, so it's a little bit slower perhaps than here in DC. But the idea of a block party is to have a social event that brings together people who wouldn't normally meet. In India, where I was in Tamil Nadu, these might be things like weddings or funerals, which bring together a large population from the local village. In Japan, these might be matsuri or festivals. Whatever the local mechanism is for bringing people together, this is one way we found of bridging across areas. We're now getting funds from the Japanese government and from several cities in America to begin having parties, actually, to try and get people out of their homes and to build these kinds of connections as a pre-disaster mitigation strategy. The bottom left-hand strategy, that is a net Indian focus group in both Nicaragua and South Africa. We've been testing in very bad neighborhoods. The ability of regular meetings on randomized topics to build up both localized trust in members of the group that meets regularly, but more generalized trust and reciprocity across society. For individuals who meet roughly for 2 hours a week for a period of 3 months, have a 15% increase in levels of trust, not only in each other, that is, people meeting in the group, but more broadly in society. We found people who work together on these kind of problems. Some of these are randomly chosen, things like AIDS, HIV/AIDS, education, women's rights, environment. Whatever the topic was, we found people believe society wants to improve. They start giving back more to the community. The bottom right-hand corner suggestion is community currencies, or time banking. We found in New Zealand, in India, and in Japan, these have a very high effectiveness in the field. When people volunteer in a community, they're given back currency often either in Japan in the form of a debit card, in India and America in the form of paper currencies. This can be spent only at local businesses, so no Walmarts, no McDonald's, no national chains. What we found is we create a virtuous cycle, where through volunteering, bringing people together who wouldn't necessarily work together, and giving them this currency, they're forced now to make a connection to a business. Those businesses now have this currency, and they have to give it to other local businesses, and we create new connections that way. And again, in the field, we found roughly a 15% increase, holding all the things constant, committed with these kind of currencies. So I would encourage you to think about social capital as a possible mechanism. Thanks very much.
Okay, before I open it up for questions, I just wanted to kind of drive home some key points that came across these different papers. One point is that there's congruency towards the notion that we're very interested in capacities, the capacity that people have to manage shocks and stresses, that shocks are important, shocks and stresses, the types of shocks and stresses are important, that we have an outcome that we're interested in, whether that be nutrition or food security or poverty, and that context really is important. So what capacities are critical in different contexts is what we need to understand. Another point I want to make is that resilience has to be looked at different levels, not just at the household level, but also at the community level and even higher systems level. And there's an interactive effect between households, communities, and these higher systems. And so when we think about measuring resilience or trying to understand resilience in an area, we have to understand these nested hierarchies that are operating in those areas. So sometimes we may not understand the importance of community social capital to creating more resilience for some communities versus others. We may not understand that if we don't have good collective action by more than one community in a given natural resource environment, you could end up with conflict between those communities because one is doing husbandry and the other one isn't. So it's the ecosystem environment is important to understand, the social systems and these marketing systems. One of the things that Mercy Corps is very good at is they've done a good job at understanding that market systems don't necessarily respect boundaries. They go across boundaries. And so when we think about systems, we have to also remember that they're not restricted by state boundaries. Whether you're talking about social systems, ecosystems, or market systems. Another thing that I think really came out was important is that we need to test hypotheses. So both John and all of the papers really, we're talking about trying to predict why certain things are happening. And we need to, the only value of having a resilient measurement is that we need to be able to predict if we see these kinds of capacities in place. We should be able to say, this community, these households, this system is more likely to be more resilient than something else. If it doesn't have any predictive value, it's not worth measuring. So I think we want to keep our eye on that ball too, and that we're testing hypotheses. You know, we try to use our learning, that's why this learning agenda that Heather was talking about is so important. We want to build up our knowledge around these things and then use that knowledge to help test some of these theories. And so the work that Cornell is doing is really important in this area. Finally, I want to really bring home the thing that Daniel was talking about with regards to collective action. This social capital and collective action that comes from social capital is really what distinguishes community resilience from household resilience. And there are, we have just written a paper that with a lot of input from Daniel's book, but on trying to measure community resilience, and there are 5 major dimensions around community resilience that I think are important. One is that informal safety nets are really critical for the bonding social capital that he was talking about. These communities also, if they've got good disaster risk reduction activities, which again John was pointing out, in some of these places where you use collective action to actually guard against disasters in the future. Conflict mitigation, collective action can be used to kind of lessen the conflict between communities in an area. Natural resource management, where collective action is actually used to take care of the resources that you have access to, and management of public goods. These are the kinds of infrastructure and various kinds of water access, or it could be even security in a community, where collective action has an important role to play. So when we think about resilience, again, the dimensions that you look at when you're talking about a household, or what you're talking about in terms of community, or what you're talking about in these broader systems, you need to recognize what distinguishes that level from the level below it. And what are the kinds of indicators that we need to make sure that we're tracking when we're looking at these differences. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. Here's the mic right here. You have to pour back behind it.
Thank you very much for the presentations. All of them were very interesting. But I was wondering, mostly for the last speaker, if you either looked at or found it to be a relevant factor, or found it that it wasn't relevant, diversity within these communities. If you had more homogeneous communities in the first place, or if you had clusters of people within the community that formed their own social groups, or if you could see them all as linked up together, that social capital means that they break boundaries across groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is on, of course. So yes, absolutely. More homogeneous communities had higher bonding social capital. So in Tamil Nadu, for example, the Patnibar fishing castes often excluded Dalits and the other most backwards castes from disaster reduction lists, for example. And USA had to go back and second time survey those communities to find individuals off the list. So yes, in this case, it was almost a double-edged sword. There was far better community cohesion in a more homogeneous community, but in those areas, peripheral social groups were often left off of the overall policies. So we found, on the one hand, they worked together more efficiently, they brought in aid more effectively, but those small number of individuals who weren't in that group often find themselves left out of those kind of lists.
To continue on the part of the community collaboration and cohesion, in the two figures that you showed, I saw that on the left axis you used the population growth rate, and I can come up with a good number of things that can influence the population growth rate. So I was wondering what the connection is there.
Sure, so post-disaster we found, whether in America, Japan, or India, one of the best predictors of health and a vibrancy of community was population recovery. Yasu did this back in 1997, and there have been 15 population studies since then. Davis and Weinstein, for example. All those books and studies argued that post-disaster, especially in mobile communities, the health of the community is determined by population recovery rates. So we had other indicators as well. We have actually in the book I talk about access to aid. In India, for example, there's work being done with my community, with my group in Beijing on the 2008 Sichuan disaster and economic questions. For all these indicators, we found that the most important predictor of the health of the community was population recovery. But again, we have evidence in the book.
Yes.
Can you hear me just from here?
Project.
I have a couple questions, mostly for Heather. You talked about some issues around understanding how your model was working, and that one of the factors you used was female-headed households. And I just wondered, because this is kind of something I struggle with as well, there seems to be a bit of a bimodal result when you look at female-headed households, because if it's truly female-headed, they can be quite vulnerable. But then you have kind of the, in quotes, female-headed, where you've got the husband and the rest of the family and other people either out making money someplace else and sending it back, so you get these remittances coming in, right? And that can really, make that household, in fact, far more resilient and less vulnerable than some of the other households because their income's so much higher. So that's my first question.
Okay, so what's the question?
The question is, did you look at that? Because you just said female-headed household, I didn't know if you were able to differentiate, because that may have been part of the reason that you were having some difficulty with that, with differentiating that piece.
Yeah, the assumption was that they were more vulnerable, but your point is well taken that isn't necessarily true in all cases. And also, we're also beginning to kind of change our thinking around that in terms of new proposals that we're looking at, and wanting to design our projects so that women are actually the agents for change, because they have so much power within a community or within a household, to really start thinking about them differently, and starting with the assumption that they are powerful, and how do we design projects to capitalize on that.
Okay. And then the second one is just a clarification. You talked about milestone threshold investments, and I just wondered, is that related, for example, to like rehabilitation of a plot of agricultural land or natural resource management, like that sort of thing? So they reach a certain threshold and they get some cash, and then they work more and get some more cash. Is it that type of thing, or is it something else?
Well, actually, we haven't really operationalized it yet, but the idea was really thinking about it more at a commune or a municipal level, so that if the municipality is the one receiving the aid, then they would have certain indicators that they would have to meet as a municipality.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know who wants to answer this question, but it's about the timing of data collection. So I know you mentioned, it would be great to have the trends, not just one point in time before. And then someone else mentioned, I think it would be good to collect data during the shock and then after the shock. And has anyone ever really been able to do all of that with resilience measurement?
I think, again, we have to recognize that we're still fairly new at this game, and we're trying to design measurement approaches that do take all of those factors into account. So if we ever get the impact evaluation launched for Feed the Future in looking at a Mercy Corps project in Ethiopia, we're actually trying to do all of those things. We're combining both qualitative and quantitative approaches, as well as interim monitoring, where we actually are looking at shocks as they're happening and then looking at how people respond to those shocks. One of the big problems that we have in measurement is that, especially when you're trying to do impact evaluation, is you do a baseline, you might do a midterm, and then you do an inline. But that doesn't always capture all of the changes that are going on in between those time points. And we realize that maybe we need to be monitoring things a little bit more closely over all the years of the project, not just at the beginning and at the end. I don't know, Mark, you want to say something?
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on in cell phone applications, and we're very much aware. A lot of what we're recommending here is yet more data collection. In many sessions, I think people talk about data fatigue and fatigue on household surveys. So we're looking at light touch cell phone applications. Tim's doing work, I think, with Mercy Corps on trigger events. And these may be just incident-based, what's going on right now, what is your immediate response, and not highly intrusive and not very time intensive. So I think that's going to be an important part of how we move forward, is taking advantage of those applications. I know that IPRI is even doing some work in using some iPhone apps, doing pulse monitoring around stress events, have people just put their finger on an app. So there's some innovations here, and we're trying to come up with some light touch data collection approaches.
Anybody else?
I was just going to say that for Food for Peace projects, we have a number of trigger indicators that we have to collect data on. So that's what we want to start doing using cell phone technology, and Frontline is really well set up for that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really helpful. And I wanted to build on that question a little bit, and the theme of technology. I guess I've got sort of a geekier part of the question for the technicians, and then I have a more practical question for you as well. So the sheer number of indicators that you're collecting, and probably make it hard to use cell phones to collect them as well. But I was wondering, this is why Al Novi early on and Tulane later used factor analysis to try to reduce that number of indicators. And if there was a silver bullet like social capital, wouldn't you have found that in the factor analysis? And in general, I was just wondering if the techniques that you're using, this is the really geeky part, include preconditions implicitly, and if you have anyone on your team looking at sort of Bayesian approaches or Markov chains or some other type of approach that could get at some of these sort of preconditions as part of the method. And this has a more practical part as well, which I did a lot of this work for a while. I know just how hard it is to properly measure these sorts of things well. And so things like aspirations, adaptation on a survey, a questionnaire survey, and these quasi-experimental approaches where you have control groups, is that really helping you get the information you want for your program? I'm thinking specifically, you said you use it for sort of strategy or learning, but is that the kind of thing you really want in a resilience program? Or are you looking for more real-time sort of information about whether or not your irrigation ditch is causing more fractions in the community or malaria as opposed to actually helping your long-term resilience goals? And so just the role of sort of rich data streams, more sort of volunteer information, video, new media, other types of volunteered information or big data that might be available from your communities who are using these cell phones more often. Are you using that type of ideas about more sort of continuous data streams as well in your thinking about how to measure this? Anyway, a couple just ideas I thought kind of might bring together the panel to think about newer approaches or different approaches. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'll comment just on one part of it. I'll use factor analysis methods and trying to get the number of indicators down there. On our technical working group, we have a cluster of people who work on estimation models, and FAO, and they have recently established a resilience analysis unit, is working very much in this area and using latent trait modeling and structural equation modeling with factor analysis as a backbone to it. We're trying to get down to that. So that's kind of the, as you said, the geeky side of it. So there is an effort in trying to get down to data reduction, and not so much to reduce the data load that's part of it, but to increase the predictive capacity of our models. So I think that's the one part I'll pass on to someone else.
Bayesian analysis is pretty rare. I haven't really seen anyone that I know of, at least, using it regularly in their analysis. Maximum likelihood is much more common. I completely agree with you that real-time, continuous rich stream analysis would be helpful. I think the problem for many of us is that the shocks come, of course, at unexpected times. Even a long-term drought, certain node wouldn't get the funding to get in. So our data collection times and the actual events themselves don't always coincide. If we had that kind of analysis, I think it would be fantastic to use in our work.
In terms of other data streams to make use of, there's nothing I can think of at the moment that we're doing, but there's some ideas around a project, for example, in northern Uganda, where it's actually a small-scale grid project working with mobile telecommunications companies. But the into those companies and the data that they have, which is essentially just who's making a call to who, in this case maybe who's transferring money to who or airtime. There's been some talk about how, potentially using that. I hadn't thought about it in the face of, okay, if we could also look at secondary data on a shock, and then look at how, what are the ripple effects in terms of those interactions, more along the lines of what Dana's research would be pointing to. It's a good idea.
Okay, another question.
Hi, I'm Christiane from LWR, and I wondered if there's a lot of discussion about evolving frameworks of measurement. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about any efforts that may have been done to look in the past, especially for implementing agencies that have been working in regions such as the Sahel for many, many years. For example, we've been there for a number of years. I know Sierra has as well. And although the data may be imperfect from sort of years of implementation in those areas, I wondered if there has been attempts at sort of meta-evaluations or data mining of what is available over 10, 15 years in the past and what that might do to inform resilience measurement going forward.
Yeah, in the technical working group, we just had our meeting last week, our first face-to-face meeting last week in Rome. We have a cluster that's dedicated to looking at existing data sets and looking at things such as the Living Standards Measurement Survey and other data sets. Doing just that we realize we need to undertake a serious data mining effort as a front end of our work, and to make sure we're not introducing new data burdens in the field, and also to capitalize on existing data that we have. So that's underway. I think we don't have anything to report at the moment. We recognize that that's important, and I expect within the next 6 months we will have something to report on that. That's kind of on a macro level. On a more focused level, that is limited level, the work that John mentioned and Heather mentioned with the Resilience Learning Consortium, Cornell's engaged with Mercy Corps, Catholic Relief Services, with World Vision, and with CARE. And right now we're looking at an array of the baseline measures and doing a resilience sensitivity analysis, looking at the shock modules and making recommendations on how this can be improved upon, looking at initial state measures and looking at response measures and looking at resilience capacity. So we're doing that at a micro level. The technical working group is meant to be doing it on a macro level, doing data mining.
Just for those of you that didn't attend the presentation that we made on Wednesday, the technical working group that Mark keeps referring to is a group that was created by the Food Security Information Network, which is a EU-funded and USAID-funded network, and it's primarily managed by FAO, World Food Program, and IFPRI. And it's meant to try to bring together academics, people that work in the UN, NGOs, so a wide array of people that have some technical knowledge around measurement and have maybe even been trying to measure resilience in the past. So there's about 17, 18 people in this technical working group, and they've been working very hard to a big breakthrough happened was we actually agreed on one definition of resilience, and once we got an agreement on that, then we can go forward on the metrics around that, measuring that definition. So that was a huge breakthrough, and so what we're seeing is more convergence around some of the key areas that we want to be looking at in terms of measuring resilience. And over the next 6 months, there will be a number of measurement papers that are coming out of this working group that will be made available to everybody, and it should help inform other agencies on how to actually approach this.
What's that definition?
Huh?
What's that?
If I tell you, I'll have to kill you. No, I'll give it to you after the meeting.
It's generally about the likelihood that individuals who are exposed to adverse events will not have suffer long-standing adverse consequences. And that's kind of the front-end definition, and we unpack that in terms of it being indexed to certain outcomes. So there's a likelihood element there, and the capacities is at the core. And by the way, with reference to the definition, there prior to our meeting and our consensus that we achieved last week in Rome, there has been discussion on where does R belong. Is it on the left-hand side of the equation? Is it right side? Is it an outcome, or is it a capacities? And we agreed that putting our measurement and empirical interest on the right side, and that we care about resilience because of its instrumental value, what it can do for outcomes of interest around human well-being.
One more question and then we have to end. Okay.
Good morning. So my question is, with thinking about the resilience, to what extent do you also think, have you looked at the literature on innovation? Because the idea out there that the lever of riches for countries is innovation, and that's how you get ahead, that's how you adapt. And so have you been looking at innovation and as an aspect of resilience?
I can respond to that. No. And I think it's a good idea. I mean, there are a lot of related terms here that we need to dig into more thoroughly. For example, where's the dividing line, both conceptually and operationally, between resilience and you bump this into sustainability, for example, and you bump into innovation. And so these are things I think we need to take into account. I mean, part of we have, I think, we suffered to a certain degree from disciplinary bias, and sometimes it depends who's in the room, what kind of disciplines are represented. On our technical work group, on which both Tim and I sit on, we have a pretty broad array of disciplines, and I think there's probably not anyone in the room who's thinking in terms of innovation. I don't know, Tim might be one, but I think it's a good point.
Well, I do think that a lot of the agencies that are engaged in resilience work do think about innovation and try to bring it in. So, for example, in our measurement paper on community resilience, innovation is definitely a big part of that. I think you guys are working on innovation, so is Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is always looking for innovative ways to improve market access or to improve reduction of conflicts. So I think everybody's actually incorporating innovation as a big part of what they're looking at in terms of resilience.
I just also wanted to say that Mark had mentioned looking at positive deviance during case studies on within communities, who is it that is more resilient and why, and learn from them. So yeah, I think we got it.
Okay, I want to thank you all for getting up early to come and listen to us. Thanks for making us not feel too alone up here, even though it's still pretty empty. But thanks a lot.